This is what global trade looks like. You're looking at actual trade data from 2012. Each dot is $100 million in exports. Colors correspond to different industries. Food products are yellow, bluish colors are mechanical devices, and so on. You can see countries are very different, not just in the mix of what they make, but also how much of it others buy. Recent years have made it uncertain what this picture might look like in the future. There is a chance we could act in ways that decelerate progress or even undo it and go backwards. You know what can help chart alternative better futures for the world economy? Some simple science of its past? It all started with little plants going on epic voyages. Today, most trade in goods moves between countries on container ships like this one. But back when ocean-faring trade really took off, ships had more personality. That is HMS Bounty, or rather, a complete seaworthy reconstruction of the historical ship that MGM Studios commissioned for this Marlon Brando film. It's the story of the first attempt in 1787 to bring breadfruit from Polynesia to the Caribbean and claim the big reward that the Royal Society in London was offering. The British were looking for the cheapest, high-calorie food source to feed the slaves who produced sugar in the Caribbean. But why the huge reward? As the crew of the Bounty would tell you, transporting live plants across oceans was not easy. As this actual plan of the Bounty shows, they stowed clay pots everywhere, both above and below deck. Neither is great for the plants. Above deck, saltwater spray will kill them. Below deck, they won't get sunlight. Also, fresh water on a sailing vessel is very limited, even more so when sailing on new routes. Over the following decades, chatter around the problem of transporting little plants on ships grew urgent. Gushing letters went back and forth, such as this one from an East India Company botanist in Mackay to the Royal Horticultural Society in London. He estimated that only about 1 in 1,000 plants survived long journeys with the conventional method. Surely, there had to be a better way of, quote, gratifying the English botanist with the plants of China. Soon, the Society's journal was publishing prototype designs from the governor of Mauritius and another botanist with the East India Company in Calcutta. Why the great excitement and urgency? As European colonies grew, the first systematic large-scale export of commodities was in things like tea, sugar, and rubber. Tea was mainly an import from China, which had a monopoly. Through the 18th century, tea had been expensive and so remained a luxury enjoyed by social elites. Meanwhile, Spanish and Portuguese colonies had begun exporting sugar. Someone decided to add a lump to tea, and suddenly, this drink was now even more popular. There was a fortune to be made in securing these plants and exporting their finished product. But as a would-be colonial trader, you have a problem. The regions that these plants are native to might not be the ones you have managed to conquer so far. You want to grow them on vast tracts of new land you now control, where you have also secured extremely cheap or free labor. That's why the stakes were high to find a more secure way of transporting plants on ships. The solution was not a revolutionary idea. By this time, glass greenhouses had long been common in Europe, but in 1842, one gardening enthusiast in London reported what he had accidentally realized. Plants survive happily for long periods in a miniaturized version of a greenhouse, a glass update to those earlier wooden prototypes, and this time, importantly, sealed. You put one of your prized tropical plants in one of these. Moisture rises during the day, and at night it condenses on the glass and trickles back down. On a ship, it's well protected from salt spray and no need to water for months. This little innovation changed not just trade, but the history of every continent.
The first tea plants were shipped from Shanghai to Assam in British India in the mid-19th century.
The East India Company hired Fortune to uncover the plants and methods China used in producing its unrivaled tea. This was a challenging and potentially dangerous mission, since the Chinese carefully protected this information, especially from foreigners. Being of Scottish descent, Fortune realized it would be necessary to travel in Chinese disguise. Fortune had some close calls, but avoided being detected as an imposter. He successfully discovered the coveted secrets of propagating, processing, and packing tea.
China lost its monopoly. The price of tea dropped, and it became a common beverage across social classes in Europe, and demand exploded. The little glass box had similar world-altering effects in other industries and regions. Just as cars were becoming popular and demand for vulcanized rubber was growing, plants grown in England from seeds smuggled out of Brazil were shipped to Sri Lanka to crush the Brazilian monopoly in the export of rubber. The Wardian case is also the reason the Cavendish banana, named for an ex-president of the same horticulture society, is the only variety of banana sold in most supermarkets outside Asia today. But in the case of one plant, the ability to move it transformed not just its trade, but the destiny of continents. Before cinchona plants were smuggled from South America to India, malaria was a great deterrent for Europeans trying to manage their colonies in other tropical parts of the world. By 1861, the large-scale Indian production of quinine made Dutch lives in Southeast Asia easier. Without quinine produced in India, the mosquitoes of Africa would have made colonizing the continent a much greater challenge.
I never knew there was so much history.
But this isn't just entertaining history or a sobering reminder. In a modern twist, the vulnerability of plants is still relevant to supply chains today. That's a little banana plant in a test tube, in deep sleep at its home. In Belgium, young banana plants have a big dorm to themselves at University of Leuven. Cocoa saplings briefly attend University of Reading in the UK. That can sound like some ominous colonial legacy, but the reason is just elementary related science. As you can guess from the example of the Cavendish banana, large-scale agriculture relies on monocultures, the same species of plant growing an optimal distance apart across vast tracts of lands. That makes the entire industry exceptionally vulnerable to disease, because it will spread very rapidly. To use a breakout phrase we learned not long ago, plants cannot socially distance. Their distance is fixed. The disease can hence wipe out an year's crop, devastating the market at both supply and demand ends. But distance really is the solution. So, when new varieties of the crop are developed, they are exiled and quarantined in greenhouses far from their home countries. The ideal locations are in a climate where the plant would not survive outside the greenhouse. Even if a disease does arise, it is contained by definition. What that shows is that while ocean-faring trade started in how regions were unequal in one sense, today we use difference and distance to make global supply chains more resilient.
There's a wider lesson there for the future, especially in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. Supply chains are reorganizing, and there's mumbling of friendshoring. One thing we learned from the quick history is that trade is about specialization. Today, we don't invade countries for economic advantage. The lesson remains that specialization can be cultivated, so to speak. It need not be rooted in localized differences. Specialization allows an industry to benefit from economies of scale. It also allows a country to selectively invest in training to hone specific human capital and specialized long-term infrastructure that has sunk costs. With stability, the industry gains experience to continually improve. To stay ahead and maintain a moat around a specialization, and the world as it is today more or less reflects that. We can see this in a breakup of what countries produce and export. Here's Peru in 2020. This is Belgium, the same year. This is Kenya. Here's Vietnam. The corollary from the modern side of the plant story in Reading and Leuven is even more important. Great as they are, the benefits of trade are far below optimal without coordination and synergy. Without symbiosis. As we saw, today, in most industries, supply chains are spread out and intricately linked, mostly guided by efficiency. But we are not already in our ideal world. As we have seen in 2021, that presents some risks. Allowing supply chains to grow organically by maximizing efficiency alone can compromise their resilience, but what friendshoring implies is a word like this. Colors imply trade blocks. Yes, it's an extremely simplified depiction. It shows only one-way suppliers. But it should be clear, that's not really a more stable world. If another big epidemic strikes, it could shut down one part of the globe. We don't know in advance which it will be. This design makes it more likely that whichever region is hit is utterly crippled and takes much longer to recover. And health is not the only risk. If there is financial contagion, it spreads among economies that are tightly knit. What our lesson from the history and science of plants tells us is that a more resilient world would be organized like this. Colors imply industries. The entire supply chain is duplicated in other locations. Of course, nothing here implies that the corporations that run these operations are locally owned or even different. Just that the operations in each chain are independent. Once again, why does this world look busier? Because it requires every country to specialize in far more industries. And here, you get a healthy rivalry between more than one region specializing in every stage in all supply chains. Specializing in everything is an oxymoron. Here's the good news, our current configuration is much closer to this world and we can transition to this more stable organizing principle more easily than fragmenting into trading blocks.
Trade doesn't require sharing politics. All you need to share for a resilient trade network is a market. But sharing a market does mean sharing rules, on contracts, copyright and competition to start with, and later, work conditions and environmental norms. Ungrounded zero-sum geopolitics sucks attention away from all the hard policy work that needs to go into maximizing the benefits of coordinated specialization. Here's an example of just one such policy. While trade has consistently benefited all countries as a net effect, within countries it usually means some industries and workers lose out. A policy solution has been known since the 60s. It is called trade adjustment assistance. In simple terms, it involves directing partial funds from the industries that win from a trade deal towards retraining workers in sectors that lose out in globalization. Similarly, with analytical foresight and coordination with trusted trade partners, you can repurpose infrastructure. Hardly any country has a good track record of designing this policy well, which is evident in anti-globalization protests in every part of the world. Workers never hear that they are entitled to a better distribution of the wealth that trade invariably creates, so they protest against trade itself instead. Against their own interests, asking for their country to remain poor because they correctly realize they will get little assistance if things change. That's because designing TAA is much harder than cheap talk of winning against some foreign country while misrepresenting the economics involved. To young people who want to be challenged in life, to make a difference to a global future, here's an idea. Don't chase pies in the sky where no one can evaluate your work or hold you accountable until 100 years after you're dead. Design trade adjustment assistance for any countries of your choice. Then, help them coordinate it so humans can fully actualize their distinctive evolutionary edge, efficient cooperation at ever larger scales. Now that is a problem that is actually worthy of the AI models we have today. There was once a time when trade within one part of the world was very different to trade with another large part of the world. That was bitter tea time. The sweet modern examples of chocolate and banana show that we have since moved forward to a time when coordination across distance is directly leveraged to shore up the resilience of our world. We can choose to not go backwards,